Let me show you how to be a good Bayesian.
Today, I am honored to host Adam Kucharski, a leading expert in infectious disease modeling and epidemic forecasting. Adam is a professor of infectious disease epidemiology and co-director of the Center for Epidemic Preparedness and Response at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. His research focuses on harnessing data and analytics to improve epidemic preparedness, and he has contributed real-time analysis to governments and health agencies during major outbreaks, including Ebola, Zika, and COVID-19. In this episode, Adam takes us inside the world of epidemiological modeling, discussing how Bayesian methods help refine predictions and inform public health decisions. We explore the challenges of modeling infectious diseases, from data uncertainty to real-time forecasting, and the importance of communicating findings effectively to policymakers and the public. Adam also highlights common misconceptions about epidemiological data and dives into the role of automation and AI in epidemic response. This is Learning Bayesian Statistics, episode 130, recorded November 26, 2024.
Let me show you how to be a good Bayesian. Change your predictions after taking information in. And if you're thinking I'll be less than amazing, let's adjust those expectations. What's a Bayesian? It's someone who cares about evidence.
Welcome to Learning Bayesian Statistics, a podcast about Bayesian inference, the methods, the projects, and the people who make it possible. I'm your host, Alex Andorra. You can follow me on Twitter at Alex_Andorra, like the country. For any info about the show, learnbayesstats.com is the place to be. Show notes, becoming a corporate sponsor, unlocking Bayesian merch, supporting the show on Patreon, everything is in there. That's learnbayesstats.com. If you're interested in one-on-one mentorship, online courses, or statistical consulting, feel free to reach out and book a call at topmate.io/Alex_Andorra. See you around, folks, and best Bayesian wishes to you all. And if today's discussion sparked ideas for your business, well, our team at PIMC Labs can help bring them to life. Check us out at pimc-labs.com. Hello, my dear Bayesians. Hope you're doing well. Two main announcements for today. First and foremost, thank you so much to all of you who sent testimonials about Learning Bayesian Statistics and Intuitive Bayes to support my green card application. I was genuinely touched, surprised, and moved by the number, kindness, and generosity of your messages. I am so happy and grateful to be surrounded by truly open-minded, kind, and helpful people like you. I received more than 40 testimonials, so thank you so much to all of you who've taken the time out of their busy day to work about a very nerdy endeavor and how it changed the field of statistics according to you. I will, of course, let you know what happens with my application, and I'm already planning a very special in-person surprise for all of you for February 2026, but more info will come in good time. So again, thank you so much, and in the meantime, live long and prosper, or shall we say, live Bayes and prosper. And talking about prospering, if you are interested in baseball and Bayesian statistics and working in an MLB team, like let's say the Miami Marlins, so that would mean working with me. If you'd love that, get to Miami, get to meet me, and maybe working together in the baseball research and baseball solutions teams. Well, now is the time. Our teams are growing fast, and this is your chance to get in on something that's very special. Honestly, I absolutely love what's going on there. And we've just opened 2 brand new roles. One baseball analyst for the solutions group, that's more geared toward junior applicants, and a senior one, which is senior data scientist in the research group. That's mine. So if you are passionate about baseball research, you love working on collaborative teams, and well, bonus points, you know your way around advanced modeling approaches, like for instance Bayesian methods with PIMC and STAN, and neural networks, time series, all that stuff. Well, we definitely want to hear for you. I think what we're doing in Miami is some of the most exciting in the MLB right now. Let me know if you have any questions. If you're a patron of the show, you're on the Discord with me, feel free to send me any of your comments, questions, recommendations of people. Send that to your friends, and maybe see you soon in Miami. On that note, let's go on with the show. Adam Kucharski, welcome to Learning Bayesian Statistics.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time and bearing with me. We've had a few technological problems to record that episode, folks. That was difficult, but you know, as they say, the obstacle is the way. So we are here, and a big thank you to Chris Wyman for putting us in contact. Chris and I met at StanCon 2024 in Oxford. Chris was actually in a panel discussion that I recorded with him and Lisa Semenova. That was episode 120 for people who are curious and want to hear more about how cool epidemiological science and computational biology are. So yeah, feel free to check that out. With Adam today, we're actually going to tackle some similar topics, but you have a very wide and very broad research. So yeah, that's why I'm super happy to have you on the show today. You do so many things, and you are also a great science communicator. You've written several books, as I've said in the introduction. So yeah, all of these books will be in the show notes. So people, feel free to check them out. I definitely recommend them. They are absolutely fascinating. But before we touch on that, can you tell us what you're doing actually nowadays, Adam, and how you ended up working on this?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, my work kind of bridges really understanding epidemics and getting better at kind of predicting and responding to them. So there's a mix of aspects to that. So some of it is understanding the drivers of what we see in terms of how things spread. So for something like dengue fever, that might be climate influences, accumulation of immunity in the population. For something like, say, flu or COVID, the implications of vaccination over time, how those viruses evolve. Alongside that, we're also doing a lot of work to build up the methods and tools that we need to respond to very quickly. During COVID, a lot of these things were developed very quickly, often just working over weekends. And can we actually do a lot better, particularly for the predictable questions that we know we're going to have to answer? In terms of how I got into it, my background's originally in maths. I've applied maths as my PhD. But even that was starting to go more in this direction of epidemiology and questions around how we can understand the process of infectious disease. And for me, as a field, it kind of sits quite nicely between something where having some mathematical and statistical understanding can give you a lot of value very quickly, but also there's enough unknowns about the underlying rules and processes. It's not something like physics where we have a lot more kind of mechanistic understanding. So it means sort of squeezing a lot more out of the data you have available, particularly under pressure in a situation like an epidemic.
I see. Okay, that's very interesting. So it's something that, yeah, it was a long time coming, right? You've always kind of been interested in these topics, at least since your post high school studies, right?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of those questions where, yeah, obviously has an enormous impact on people, but also just from a kind of curiosity point of view, these are quite hard questions, and often the methods that are in the textbooks don't quite work for what you need to do. So it's an ongoing, interesting research area to be in, because almost every epidemic you work in, what you thought you knew and what you thought you'd solved, suddenly you haven't. And so, yeah, it's kept me busy and kept me interested, along with many of my colleagues.
Yeah. And what about Bayesian stats? Do you remember when you were first introduced to them?
So I think it's particularly during PhD. So I think my kind of undergrad was a lot more traditional maths, so relatively little statistics, a lot more kind of theory. So the sort of thing where you'd learn measure theory rather than learning the kind of coming at it from a data point of view. But I think during my PhD, I started working a lot more with data, and especially if you start to look at processes involved in diseases, processes involved in immunity, the natural next question is, well, how can we estimate things meaningfully? within that. And then particularly if you have patchy bits of data or different studies that you want to kind of combine in some way, or if you have some analysis you've put together and then you want to make statements about additional data coming in, Bayesian statistics are a natural framework for doing that. And so really in the mix of my work, in some cases you just get simple probability problems, and Bayes formula is a nice get out of jail way of solving that problem. And in other cases, it's more of a framework for thinking about the entire analysis, that you want to be able to come to the best possible explanation or the best possible evidence at a given point in time, but then you want to update that as you get more data coming in. And again, it gives you a very nice toolkit for doing that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Damn, that's really fascinating. That brings me a lot of more questions for you, Adam. Yes, one of these questions that I have for you is, especially during COVID, Bayesian modeling became a crucial tool. I remember I did some work at my very low level at that time, but you did a bunch of work on that. And as you were saying, I imagine there were a lot of very short nights and very long weeks. Can you share specific examples of how these models were able to inform public health decisions?
Yeah, so I think there's quite a few instances, particularly around scenarios, where models can be a very useful kind of decision support tool. Because essentially, if you're going to make a decision about what to do in an epidemic, everyone has a model in their head. Because if you think, let's do this, let's try this, you're making some assumptions about what you think is going to happen. You're making some assumptions about how you think epidemics work. So models are a very nice way of allowing us to really write down and formalize what we think those processes are and what we think the intervention is going to do. And then we can debate whether that's reasonable, whether that's not, so we can see if that generates any counterintuitive effects. But in doing that, you really want to capture the extent of information you have about the problem you're dealing with. So even, for example, the question of how much effort is it going to take to get transmission down? Well, one of the key things that is going to influence that is how much transmission there really is. So a lot of the analysis that we did, being able to pass around uncertainty was really important. So very early in the pandemic, for instance, because we were relying on quite uncertain data from China, quite uncertain data about exported cases, we had some sense of what transmission would do in a country without any control measures, but there was quite a large amount of uncertainty on that, probably reproduction number somewhere between 2 and 4. And so what we wanted to do is, when we generate UK scenarios to present them, we didn't want to give one number. We wanted to say, look, we don't know actually if it's more at the upper end or lower end of this, but we want to kind of define that uncertainty in what we simulate. And then after that wave comes through, we had lockdowns like many other countries. There was this push to reopen. And then the question is, okay, so we've had that wave, what's the reopening going to look like? And again, that's where these kind of Bayesian methods can be very helpful, because we can take the uncertainty and perhaps we've got more confidence now about what we're dealing with, but then we want to pass that level of confidence into what's going on in the future. And then, as variants started emerging, that became even more important, because often for alpha, we would have some degree of confidence about how much more transmissible it was, how much more severe it was. And in any analysis, for example, we did a lot of work early in 2021 of how quickly you're going to have to vaccinate. And I think there's a lot of pressure to lift lockdown, and trying to understand that trade-off. If you're vaccinating at this rate and you're lifting lockdown this quickly, what's that going to look like? And again, none of those values you had very precisely, and you had more epidemic data coming in all the time. And as particularly that process of reopening in 2021, there was that very tight relationship between models and policy, because in the UK, it was one of the few times where the policy was actually very informed by what was useful from a technical point of view. And so what they did was they had these series of steps in the roadmap, and it was designed to give enough signal in the data post each step that if something was going very wrong, they wouldn't have implemented another step before you had that signal. So they were kind of deliberately spaced out, so the models and the epidemiologists would have enough time to work out what that relaxation had done. So again, from a kind of Bayesian point of view, that's really nice because it gives you enough time to kind of update your posterior sensibly before you do the next step and work out what effect that's going to have.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That's fascinating. I didn't know there was that level of coordination where you could actually do that.
I think there were many examples where it didn't work in such a coordinated fashion, but I think that roadmap reopening was one where there was a much tighter relationship between the questions coming down from policy and what models needed to say something sensible about the implications.
Yeah, and I guess I'm also wondering, how much do you think the pendulum has swung back from then? Do you think we'll be faster to implement these workflows and improve them next time there is a pandemic, or will we have to work from a blank slate because politics is so short-sighted with very short, cycles?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think there's some things that have been positive in terms of progress. So I think in terms of what we're doing and others in consolidating a lot of the tools that are available. So some things now that we, looking at quick questions at H5N1, questions that I just wouldn't have bothered doing previously just as a curiosity because it would have been 3-4 hours just for a maybe question. And now in 20 minutes, you can get a rough example. So I think that's quite nice. It's bringing things into reach. But I think in terms of just staff capacity and people to do this work, I think there are a lot of people who, put a huge amount of time in, often as around the world, getting pulled off different roles and off other projects. And so I think in a way, in that sense, we probably don't have the same workforce who could undergo that amount of pressure for that amount of time. So in a way that creates the necessity of we need to get better tools because we don't have, I think, that volume of people, but also just, all our projects. So we basically took people off a lot of other funded projects. And I think we wouldn't have the resource to do that in the same way now. So for me, I think particularly what we're interested in at the moment is if you imagine the set of tasks that you might have to do in an epidemic, some are tasks that a lot of other people have to do, and we can really predict ahead of time you're going to need to do that. So stuff like working out the severity of infection or working out the transmission, we know we're going to need that done. We know lots of people are going to do that. So that's a really good task for automation and getting really leading edge, Bayesian methods standardized so everyone can do that and we don't all have to duplicate effort. There's other things that can be really specific. Maybe within a country, there's a kind of subgroup that's particularly important, or there's a certain variant or something you might want to deal with. And that's going to require more domain knowledge. And I think at the moment, even if you talk to people at different, outbreak organizations around the world, they probably spend 60 or 70% of their time on quite low level, predictable, data wrangling type questions, rather than the sort of 30% of expertise led questions they'd want. And I don't necessarily think in a pandemic people would end up working less hard because everyone wants to contribute as much as they can. But I think what I'd like to see is a lot more time on that 30% and going much deeper into what we can understand, rather than spending a lot of time, even just trying to get a sense of the data and the basic tasks to answer very simple questions.
Yeah. That makes sense. Not sure I'm really reassured by that answer, but that's, I'm sure it's the realistic answer. Something I'm also really curious about because I see that a lot as a modeler myself, is where are the common misconceptions that you've seen the public or elected officials or even professionals have about epidemiological data, and what the scientific community can do to clarify these misunderstandings?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think one common misconception is even just what data are as a thing. I think often when people talk about raw data, they're talking about inferred estimates. So I think one example of this is excess deaths that I think the media often treat as a measured thing rather than actually a counterfactual. And I think I remember talking to journalists about the comparison with flu. And I think a lot of them discovered that the flu mortality statistics they've used every year actually involve some quite big modeling assumptions about seasonal patterns behind them. And there isn't just this magic number that we measure.
Right.
I think similarly with a lot of the estimates, for example, in the UK, they ran randomized testing surveys. So they randomly tested people in the community each week and reported it. And that number, that wasn't a raw proportion because, of course, you needed to do some standardization across groups and weighting. And in some cases, because it was quite noisy across multiple panels, they would have, a kind of smooth underlying proportion and then infer that. So it was sensible modeling, but there was modeling behind that. And I think the misconception often is that these things are raw data, but often, even a very simple thing, if you calculate, if you run a survey and calculate a proportion, you're making some modeling assumptions. Or if we're going to adjust for age. Well, why are you adjusting for age? Why are you not adjusting for something else? You're making assumptions about what you think are important drivers of that thing you're measuring. So I think that's probably one thing we can get better at communicating is that actually this distinction between models and data isn't that simple, that a lot of the things we think are data are actually modeled estimates. And actually a lot of the things that sometimes people treat as super complex models are actually just quite straight, simple steps for thinking about data. So even one of, if you've got a bunch of hospitalizations over time and you want to know when the infections happened, you can use quite simple, like a deconvolution model just to take that and work out when the infections are. And I think often in public perception, when people talk about models, what they mean is very complicated scenario models that people are assuming are used to make forecasts. So I think it's often the kind of a crystal ball. I've used this big complex model to say what's going to happen. And I think in reality, what happens is that often the more complex models are used for scenarios and like what if, because we can't make forecasts often in pandemics as well, because you'll be forecasting what policymakers are going to do. And if your models are used as tools to support their decisions, it becomes quite odd to use that as a forecast. I mean, I think the example I sometimes give is that imagine you're playing a game of poker and at each point in time, you want to understand the implications of your decisions. What you don't really want is someone on your shoulder saying, I bet you're going to fold later this round. What you want is someone who can say, look, if you raise, this is likely the situation you're going to face. This is the risk you're taking on. If you fold, this is potentially what the outcomes are going to be. So that's really how a lot of these models are used in kind of decision support. But I think in public consciousness, they're often seen as we're saying this is going to happen in the future. And I think part of it is communication, and particularly those simple. I think getting people to be able to play with those simpler models can be very helpful. So they realize it's not this super complex thing. It's probably what they're doing in their head, but just writing it down in a bit more of a structured way.
Yeah. I find also, indeed, walking through scenarios is something that's really helpful to people because, well, they can imagine the scenarios, and that's much more, tangible and concrete than numbers and percentage distributions. I can see that a lot. I mean, sports is a lot like that, especially baseball. Lots of different discrete scenarios.
Yeah, and I think often people, particularly with epidemics, are kind of doing it in their head all the time. That so the epidemic's going up, and you say there's going to be a problem, and then you get a few data points that seem to be tailing off a bit, and basically everyone's doing that updating in their head of where they think it's going. But they often, I would have loved to have seen more politicians and journalists actually write down you could get them to actually just write down their prediction and their kind of distribution of what they think is going to happen, and then see how there's update. And then you could actually give them a better understanding of what's going on in their head relative to actually what's plausible given the data that's coming in.
Yeah. But so I completely agree with that. And I really love that. But I think here the incentives are really bad for politicians, right? Because then if you publicly, privately, I think that's
do that a lot. I think that's a really good point. Yeah. I think that's a really good point. Yeah, I think getting politicians to write down what they think is going to happen publicly is very difficult. But I think even privately, I think there were a lot of people probably not doing that would, so amongst colleagues and stuff, we sometimes just had private email things of when you think this study comes out, what do you think it's going to show? And I think it's sometimes quite, we like to kid ourselves. So even if it's just writing it down for yourself, I think it's just quite useful to have that to reflect on.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I'm like completely on board in helping people develop a more probabilistic thinking. I think you doing the work you're doing and also the communication work you're doing is very important. All your books. That's also why I have this podcast. People like Nate Silver and writing books is very important too. Like, I don't know if you read his last book, On the Edge, but that's very important too for that, right? And I think that'd be awesome if we were gearing towards that direction. But yeah, the problem is like the public incentives in politics are so bad when it comes to that you actually have a much better standing if you just, say anything and everything and just are not held accountable for that, than actually, betting on something that would happen and then changing course if actually what you said would happen did not. And then,
Yeah, and I think partly from the communication, but there's also what are the things that we can do meaningfully, and what are the things that you can encourage people to do versus just what's feasible. And I think also just from a kind of modeling point of view, sometimes there's this idea that for political decisions, you should have this big model with absolutely everything in and all the kind of the weights of how you do everything. And I mean, I can't see any political party wanting to do it, because ultimately those things are going to be weighed, not in a kind of written down, we're going to put 10% on this and 15% on this. And so I think it's working out, where the science can be really informative and where actually there's more of that kind of human political element, and that, that's not the best battle to be fighting at this point.
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, in your talking about your books, in your in the Rules of Contagion, you explore why things spread, and I really love that. So can you tell us a bit more about that, and how does Bayesian thinking help in understanding these patterns, especially for diseases?
Yeah, so I think that's something sort of striking writing the book is I set out thinking that there would be these analogies in other fields, and I wasn't sure necessarily how strong they would be. But the more I dug into that, I realized actually they were, in many cases, very explicit and very directly informative. For example, after the 2008 financial crisis, there was very clearly described epidemic thinking that drove a lot of the interventions we saw. So things like ring fencing, things like capital requirements for banks at risk in network. It's really about thinking about it like a contagion problem. Similarly, if you dig into the history of companies like BuzzFeed that were very good at generating viral content, they were actually writing research reports on how you evaluate the reproduction number of marketing campaigns. And actually, I subsequently discovered that BuzzFeed journalists would have a measure equivalent to the reproduction number as a metric for their articles. So it wasn't just this quite fuzzy comparison. Actually, this was the same bits of theory that were appearing between these two fields. I think one thing I found quite interesting on the Bayesian angle in how things spread is particularly some of the debates around how you convince people and how kind of people adopt beliefs and they take off. Because there was quite a popular idea for a while known as the backfire effect, which is where if you try and convince someone, you can end up basically just strengthening their pre-existing belief. And this idea that attempts to change people's beliefs can kind of backfire, which obviously doesn't bode well for any kind of social progress, because it's this idea if you try and convince someone that, marriage equality or something's a good idea, it's just going to lead them to be entrenched. But what subsequently happened is a lot of the work, both on the applied side of actually people trying to get support for these kind of this progress. But also on some of the scientific side of people studying them, suggested it's actually much closer to a Bayesian problem, that it's not that you're leading people to entrench in their beliefs. Rather, if you give people weak evidence, you're not going to shift their distribution much, which I thought was kind of really interesting. And I hadn't actually thought about it quite much in that way. And it kind of makes sense that even if you've got like a, quite a strong prior for something, if someone gives you evidence that agrees with that prior, it's going to look pretty similar afterwards. And especially because we're not doing all those calculations in our head, we're just sort of seeing the feeling we come away with. And it really struck me that actually in those situations, we're probably much better at evaluating the effects of evidence that we disagree with, because the posterior, just mathematically, you expect the posterior to move more. And so perhaps those situations where what people were thinking was a backlash effect is more just we're better at critiquing evidence we disagree with rather than the ones that kind of line up, because if it agrees with us, we're going to walk away with the same opinion afterwards anyway. So yeah, I think it's obviously a much harder problem to study in terms of spread of beliefs. There's so many factors that kind of play into that. But there's still a lot of ongoing debate on the extent to which people's adoption of beliefs and behaviors is Bayesian versus, some other factors that kind of explain how those are updated over time.
Yeah, I see. That's really amazing. I love that. I didn't know that that example about what's the website you were saying?
BuzzFeed. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
It's remarkable. Yeah, and it was kind of interesting because they did, campaigns around Hurricane Katrina with. None of these were viral, and this is one of their key findings, that this wasn't like COVID where it just spread and spread and spread. But for 10 shares, they might get an extra 7 or 8. So if you get it, if you spark lots of little clusters of sharing, you might actually get quite considerable additional uptake as a result. I think there was one that was a marketing campaign for detergent, and it just wasn't transmissible at all, basically. So it was quite a nice quantifying that there's certain things that people obviously want to tell people about, and others that even if you've got the biggest marketing budget in the world, you're going to struggle to make, washing up liquid contagious.
I see. Yeah. And I'm curious about, and I asked this question to Chris too at StanCon, is concretely what does it look like for you to work on an epidemiological model? Like, who are you talking to, and what's your workflow and technical stack?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think generally anything we build starts with a problem, and often that problem either comes from someone, if it's a policy related question, it'll come from someone on the policy side. So maybe it scientific advisors to certain agencies. In the case of like an applied organization like MSF or WHO, it will come from a representative who will be working on maybe that outbreak or that situation. And there'll often be quite specific things that people are interested in. Yeah, so it might be a forecast of actually like, what are we dealing with? It might be that there's a plan to implement vaccination or control measure. A lot of the work we did in Ebola, for example, different control measures being proposed, and people wanted some idea of the relative impact that would have. There's also, of course, just on the scientific side, so the work we've done around effects of behavior and immunity, it might be that you've got lab colleagues who've noticed some interesting features and want to work out how can I get sufficient estimates out of my data. I mean, this is, I think, another example where Bayesian thinking is very helpful, that you might have, say, lots and lots of antibody responses. And you don't want to analyze them all as like individual data sets, because there's going to be some commonalities in just how the biology works between individuals. So having those kind of hierarchical models can be very powerful, because you can have shared information just on the underlying dynamics across the population, but you can also have individual features of what people have had previously and this sort of thing. In terms of developing the kind of model and stack, it depends a bit on whether it's similar to another problem we've seen. So in case of a policy question, often what we'll do is, in the many models and things we've dealt with previously, you'll find the thing that's most similar. And I think increasingly we're seeing progress in libraries. So a lot of the work we do is in R, or in some cases using kind of Stan backends. And so you'll take something that maybe is from the library that you think is most appropriate for that, and then a model that's templated up that's closest to that. And then ideally you'll just plug in and work straight away. Often you might either adapt some features of the model process in terms of, say, how transmission's happening or what groups are affected, or you might bring in different data. So you might have a model set up for UK contact structure, and you'll just import data from somewhere else so you can adapt it. In other cases, you might get something that's a very specific, quite niche question. So, for example, I don't know, like the ones during COVID, testing people at certain types of gathering or something. And that's not something necessarily you have a model off the shelf, but in some cases, the equation's quite simple to write down. If you've got this many people and you're testing this many at this point in time, and in that case, we might just build something more bespoke. And I think the challenge always, like with any kind of software development problem, is to what extent do you do something quick for a very specific problem versus take on coding debt if you've got to do that problem repeatedly. And so I think we're getting a better sense now. There's certain things that are sufficiently complex. There's large enough scope for bugs. It's going to be useful to enough people where actually that makes sense to package it up more consistent as library. And there's other things that actually are simple enough and transparent enough and kind of bespoke enough that you don't want to build a software tool for every single one of those. Some of those you can just do quickly as the problem arises.
Yeah. That makes tons of sense. And once you're like, I'm wondering also the size of the teams in these cases, because honestly, each time I talk to a modeler in your field, it sounds like the models are really big and huge and take a lot of time to work on because they are so complex. So yeah, I'm wondering how many people does it take to work on a model, and how do you actually do that? Because is everybody working on the model at the same time? Do you have some team for that part of the model, another team for the other part? How does that?
Yeah, so I think, to give the example of some of the big COVID scenario models that are used by our group in the UK, I haven't got the GitHub repo off the top of my head, but it's probably, at least 10, 15 people who've made substantial contributions to that code base at various points in time. And in some cases, it can be, ideally we'd make these things as modular as possible. So early on, for instance, I had some colleagues who were focusing very much on the transmission dynamics and kind of how people interact and what the interventions were going to be. And I worked a lot more on the sort of disease burden module. So once you have transmission infections, you can convert those infections into an estimate of how many are going to be hospitalized, how long are they going to be hospitalized for. So then you have that kind of basic model structure, but then over time that got expanded because variants came in, vaccines came in, and you end up with multiple versions of those models. And there's always this kind of challenge of, do you make kind of one core model that has sufficient flexibility to do all those problems, or do you kind of fork a model and use it for a special case and you're not going to use it again? So that model's actually been used for multiple countries. We adapted it to a whole range of different settings, some cases with very unusual patterns of immunity and infection. And in that case, it didn't make sense just to build that into the original model because it was just such a kind of specific example. But I think that's one thing where, as well, if we had to go back now, because there's so many versions of the model and so many applications, because it's real time and we had to deliver that very quickly, it's obviously harder to now say, how would we do that for a flu epidemic? And so I think what we're trying to move more towards is these very modular examples that you can plug in all the bits you need, but also have that capacity to adapt it. And I think that's kind of an ongoing challenge, that you can have these things that are very stable and structured, but very hard to adapt, or you can have these things that are very maybe flexible and easy to adapt, but not necessarily as kind of efficiently structured as you like. I mean, there are examples as well of modeling where it might be one or two people developing something quite quickly, or just making use of a library. I mean, some of the popular methods, for example, for estimating reproduction numbers, that tool will have been used by a huge amount of people, but obviously the active contributors to the development might be a lot smaller.
Okay. Yeah, I see. Yeah, so big diversity in the size of the projects. And do you have a favorite type of models actually that you'd like to share with us?
So I think one of the models that I think has delivered a lot of value in various things that we've worked on over the years. So actually, it was both on some of the H7N9 analysis we did about 10 years ago, the outbreaks in China, where you had infections coming from poultry and potential human-to-human transmission as well. There's a big question of looking at that human data, how much was coming from spillover, how much was coming from human-to-human infections. And we actually got an analogous version of the problem with some of the COVID variants. So for Delta, how much of this was imported cases from India versus transmission establishing in countries? And in both those situations, so first of all, it's a bit of a modeling headache because a lot of traditional models are structured in a way that basically says, if you've got your cases over time, the new cases that appear, it has to be one of those past ones that infected them. Mm-hmm. So if you look at a lot of the common calculations for how you do reproduction numbers, it's known as a generative model. So in other words, renewal equation is the kind of specific version. So the new infections are the products of the infections that come before. Someone has caused that infection. If you've got importations or spillover, that's no longer the case. You've actually got this additional term coming into your equation. So it makes it a trickier inference problem if you've got two routes to infecting someone. But it can also be a more powerful one because in the case of avian flu, we knew when the wild live poultry markets were closed. And in the case of Delta, we knew when the travel ban against India was implemented. Mm-hmm. So what you've got as a kind of estimation problem, you've got two things that are influencing your infections, but you know the kind of shape of one of these because you know when the market's closed, you know when the flight patterns came in. And suddenly that gives you a lot more estimation power on the thing you care about, which is human-to-human transmission. So I think for me, that's just a really nice example of a model that is not super complicated. It's very relatively easy to explain. It's like there's two things that are going to affect someone, which is it? But actually, you can squeeze a remarkable amount out of your data as soon as you know the shape of one of those processes.
Okay. And does that, I mean, it obviously comes with significant challenges, I'm guessing, these models. Can you detail a bit these challenges that you face when creating such models?
Yeah, I think there's a whole mix. I mean, in some cases, there's just understanding the process you define in your model. That for a lot of outbreaks, there's a lot of things you'd like to know the role of in a process. So, for example, how different age groups are interacting or affected by certain things. But in some cases, you might not have the data that you need to actually pick that apart. So a good example in COVID was a lot of people, the epidemic would come down, and a lot of people would argue about why that was. And actually, if you just look at case data or just look at deaths, it could be immunity, it could be changes in behavior, it could be something to do with the climate, it could be, a whole range of different things that could influence that transmission. And just looking at one time series of outcomes, you can't distinguish what those are. You really need some data on antibodies, you need some data on social mixing to tell you which of those is the most likely explanation. So I think that's often a big challenge, is where you have lots of potential explanations and you can't actually untangle them. I mean, the other, to use H5N1 as a current example, unlike the H5N9 and Delta, where we knew how that shape of the introductions was changing, we don't know that for H5. So now you get cases popping up and they say they haven't had a contact with poultry. Maybe it's a wild bird, maybe it's a human, we've got no idea. And I think that's a kind of big challenge. Almost a model can't really tell you anything at this point because just the data is so uninformative about the process that there's lots of questions at the moment. I get journalists who ask, you're building models of H5. But actually, the outbreak data is just too bad to say much. We can design some what if hypothetical models, but I think that's much harder. I think there's also just the technical challenge that in terms of just making sure that the models you build are without bugs, and then also Edge case is another classic one that there's there can be sometimes some slightly counterintuitive things, particularly if you're doing with kind of delay processes. So one example, which I think it was sort of a communication one, but even if you have an epidemic that's going up and you suddenly stop it and you have a delayed outcome like deaths, the peak in when the epidemic stops isn't the same as the peak in deaths, because you're doing a kind of delayed convolution. We're doing a sort of smooth out delay distribution. And so features like that making sure that you've actually got that relationship defined properly. And again, this is, I think, why the move to a lot more established libraries, rather than trying to make sure these things are sort of bug-free in real time.
Okay. Yeah. And a question I often get, personally, and I'm guessing you are getting a lot too, is, okay, cool. I get uncertainty estimation, with the Bayesian models. Why do I care?
So I think a lot of what you want to do, particularly in decision making, comes down to confidence and evidence. So particularly in the middle of an epidemic, there's a lot of things we don't know with any confidence. So I guess on the one hand, you could just ignore it and just go for the point estimate. Is it going up? Is it going down? But particularly if you want to say, you want to ask, is the epidemic under control? It's not very helpful to have a yes, no always. That you might want to say, yes, it's under control. How confident are you that it is? And again, having that uncertainty in a reproduction number, if you're like, well, 100% of our density is below 1. And that's what we had post-lockdown, some social mixing data, for example, in the UK, that there was uncertainty in that distribution, but all of that density was below 1. So the conclusion was, we're very confident that transmission is coming down. I think similarly for some of the variants, we found that you'd get uncertainty in the estimates. So maybe it's 30% more transmissible, maybe it's 40%, maybe it's 50%. But you can be very confident it is more transmissible. And I think it's a difficult one, because policymakers sometimes love single answers. They don't want a kind of vague. But I think particularly if your uncertainty lands either side of a particular threshold that matters, that can, in a way, give you more confidence in communicating, of saying, look, this is definitely going up, or this is definitely, or almost definitely under control. So it's similar, in a clinical trial, you look at the confidence interval. I think it's the equivalent of that. You want to know, how much can you rely on this estimate? And I think that's where the uncertainty really comes in.
Yeah. So basically, making sure that you're not fooled by the variance of your processes.
Yeah, and I think especially when you're dealing with exponential processes, that errors can accumulate. There's something that might feel quite small of, the transmission rate's this, and actually if it's slightly higher or slightly lower, you get a very different outcome. Or even something, say as a very simple example, each person affects 2 others, and you cut transmission in half. So each person affects 1 other, or just under 1 other. A tiny amount of uncertainty there after 2 months could be the difference between a massive epidemic and a handful of cases. And if you don't communicate that, people be asking, well, why is there a massive epidemic when you said it would fizzle out based on your best estimate?
Yeah. That's definitely a good point. And I'm curious also to hear your thoughts about the latest advancements that we've seen in the last year in artificial intelligence and large language models, because I'm guessing this is going to have also an impact, hopefully for the best, on epidemiology. So yeah, with these advancements, how do you see the future of the field of epidemiology and the role of Bayesian stats in it?
Yeah, I think there's a huge amount of really promising development. I think a lot of it at the moment that we're working on, and lots of others, is trying to find, where do these solutions work? I think essentially we've been given this increasingly amazing toolkit, but in many cases it wasn't necessarily developed for the exact problems we're working on. And so finding where the applications where it's going to be very powerful, where are the ones that it's going to struggle. more. And so even if you look at AI or some more traditional machine learning approaches, that there might be situations where if we're very interested in the mechanism and we've got some process we've defined in our model, perhaps that estimation or that prediction approach isn't optimal for actually what we're trying to solve. But I think equally, the pandemic really showed there was a huge amount of data out there that in many cases we weren't able to interpret in a meaningful way. So you might have something like a social contact, and if it drops by a certain amount, that you can put that in a model in a very meaningful change. But you might have quite a lot of very noisy data, which is giving some indication about how people are behaving, but you can't extract those features and weigh them in a useful way in the same sense that an AI model could do. So I think it's, in a way, it's finding a range of problems. I think broadly, the challenge we have for outbreaks is often that they're quite rare events. So even what do you validate against, and what's your input, and what's your kind of outcome that you're trying to predict. But I think within a epidemic, especially you get larger clinical data sets, larger behavioral data sets, there's a lot of value there. I think also some of the methods like universal differential equations and other things coming through, where it's taking that sort of transmission model structure, but then incorporating things like neural networks to allow for more complexity in understanding the patterns that are kind of going on alongside that. I think there's a lot of really interesting progress there. I think just more generally in the field, there's some of the AI models that essentially are learning features that can, weather forecasting is one example where it's many times faster and less energy intensive for simulation. So I think again, that kind of, you can find ways of kind of approximating more complex models. I think just in terms of the data that comes in, I mean, a lot of outbreaks are often described in narrative reports, where it's kind of like a few paragraphs. So and so did this and went here and did that. And one of my colleagues did some nice prototyping, Billy Quilty, on this sort of local models that can take those quite difficult to interpret narrative reports and can convert them into structured data, which you can then perform standard analysis on. And then you've got the issue of accuracy and validation. But I think there's a lot of work, really across the spectrum, both in models themselves, but also how you're more efficient in what goes into them.
Yeah. Okay, I see. So, basically, in a lot of other fields, you would like to see kind of a better communication between these kind of models, the LLM models, and the humans in the loop, but clearly you don't see these kind of models being made entirely by artificial intelligence.
No, but we've tried it actually. So even things like Copilot Workspace, which look, you try them out on a simple problem and they look really, really cool. So the idea that you can just give it a code base and tell it to do things. But often for quite specific things, if you say, build me a model with these features to do this, I think because just the training set just doesn't include anything resembling, or very little resembling, that kind of problem. So if you want an LLM to build you some JavaScript, it's pretty good because there's just so much to train on. If you want quite a niche mathematical model for an epidemic, it sort of struggles in some way. So I think finding the shape, it's great for, I've got all these functions, can you package them up and add the documentation and this kind of stuff? It makes a lot of tasks faster. But I think, the idea is just going to do science, I think, is mainly put forward by people who've only worked on a narrow set of scientific problems. And there's probably some science that's going to do well, and then there's some that's going to really struggle with, hopefully not just the boring bits, but I think we need to map out where those gaps are.
Yeah. I mean, and it's the same, it's the same in my field, whether that's sports modeling or just, statistical modeling in general, where it's really funny because if you ask an LLM what a hierarchical model is, it can explain it extremely well. That's exactly what I would explain my students. But then if you ask for PIMC code of that, the model is not at all hierarchical. It's just a classic model, but the LLM will be like, well, this is a hierarchical model. But it's not.
Are you sure?
Yeah. So I definitely have tried that back and forth, but it makes you more efficient. Also, it can, it helps me, for instance, to kill my darlings maybe a bit faster, which is very important in modeling. That's always better to do it, in my experience, with a human. But sometimes you don't have someone at the same stat level as you in your organization or project. So then you have to do that on your own, and that can be quite hard.
I think that's something we're using it actually for things like reviewing training materials, because sometimes you want a thorough human view, but sometimes you want the first pass of, if an applied field epidemiologist is reading this, is there anything in there that just is going to not make sense, or really, really obvious things you want to fix? It can just help accelerate a lot of that kind of production process.
Okay. Yeah. That's actually, that sounds very useful. So you've been already very generous with your time. So I'm gonna play us out here, but I'm also curious to hear your thoughts about more educational perspective, because you do a lot, as we've heard, a lot of public communication. So given your experience, what educational initiatives would you recommend to better prepare the next generations of epidemiologists, yes, but also policymakers and citizens in general?
Yeah, I think there's probably like some specific angle, but then also just kind of more general ones. I mean, I think it's not realistic to try and get people to have a deep understanding of epidemics any more than it's realistic to get them to have a very, very deep understanding of kind of nuclear threats or something. But I think there are certain features of epidemics which are very important and very often misunderstood. So I think one aspect is exponential growth is a concept that's people find very, very difficult. I mean, you look at who makes and loses money in finance, and there's a definite divide in terms of understanding that's a concept. And so I think having more intuition of that across more people is very helpful. Similarly, things like having lagged outcomes, that if you have an event you care about and then an effect that happens later, that's something that's kind of widely misinterpreted during the pandemic. And I think it wasn't increasingly as COVID went on, it wasn't just people who hold academic posts in epidemiology that were making a lot of useful contributions. You had a lot of people who were from adjacent industries who are maybe actuaries or in finance or in other bits of academic work, or even just maths teachers or whatever, doing quite useful stuff because they had an understanding of those concepts and could get a feel for some of those data problems that just needed more eyes on them. So I think for me that's where a lot of value is. It's like, how do we have more people who can just not get very basic things wrong and just have useful eyes on the problem, even if they don't know the ins and outs of exactly how you calculate that specific parameter. I think more generally, though, we're also just seeing, I think it's a challenge for a lot of fields that with the emergence of AI, with the emergence of climate, sort of more complex understanding of epidemics, I think we are moving into a world where it's much harder to sort of teach yourself everything from scratch. I mean, if you think about even statistics as a field, the sort of statistics that practitioners do relative to what's taught in schools is now very different. It's the sort of doing kind of regression lines and the things that I did at A level. And I think we're seeing that in a lot of fields now, where actually the cutting edge is so far detached that I think that can create partly challenges in communication, because even if you are very interested in climate, I can't go and run a climate model in the way that you might be able to sort of do a simple mathematical proof or a simple kind of statistical problem. So I think there's that kind of relationship of how do we build trust and enough understanding of how those fields work that people can engage with them, even though actually the kind of cutting edge is now so computationally intensive, in some cases just so difficult to explain in terms of the algorithms. I think that AI is a prominent example, but I think there's a lot of those situations where it feels like there's a bit of a growing gap that we need to bridge.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, completely agree with everything you just said. That's a topic that's dear to me, obviously, and we've talked about that several times on the podcast. I think one of the best episodes we've done about that was episode 50 with Sir David Spiegelhalter, only Sir, yet to have been on the podcast. But yeah, that was a great episode. David is an awesome communicator also. So I'll put that episode in the show notes for people who want to dig deeper, because yeah, definitely one of the episodes I recommend a lot. And then the next one, episode 51 with Aubrey Clayton, about his book, Bernoulli's Fallacy, and the Crisis of Modern Science. Really recommend the book and the episode also, because these two together make a great combination if you're interested in epidemiology. Okay, well, Adam, that was awesome. Really, thank you so much for taking so much time. That was, yeah, I knew that was going to be fascinating, and it was. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to Chris Wyman again. But before letting you go, of course, I'm going to ask you the last two questions I ask every guest at the end of the show. One, if you had unlimited time and resources, which problem would you try to solve?
That's a big one. I think one of the things coming out of COVID that really struck me is, with a lot of infections, we're actually quite unambitious, I think. That we put up with a lot of disease in daily life. And even in pre-COVID, if you look at a lot of the adverts for medicine when you're ill, it's, just keep going. And I think we saw a lot of indications during COVID for some of the sort of technologies and approaches that weren't lockdowns, but were actually much more efficient, and even just like the work that Oxford have done on things like digital tools. So I think we've got these little signals that we could be much, much better in how we tackle these problems. And I think that's something that would require quite a lot of resource and time to do effectively. But even that, I've got young children, and there's a lot of kids that are kind of hospitalized with a lot of infections that we could understand, we could test about. And I think we rely a lot on, we wait for a vaccine to be developed, but I think I've always just wondered, could we do something a bit cleverer? Can we got all this technology? There's a US colleague who during COVID said, this is our Apollo mission. Can we actually do something extremely innovative and ambitious to solve COVID? I think vaccines were amazing, some of the treatments coming down, but we didn't, I think, solve that much earlier problem of what to do about infection. So yeah, I'd love us to live in a different world where we can actually build on all the tools and technology where we've got emerging.
Yeah. Definitely share that passion and objective. And if you could have dinner with a great scientific mind, dead, alive, or fictional, who would it be?
So I think I've recently for a project been reading up a lot about William Gossett, aka Student, who developed t-tests and worked at Guinness. But actually, digging more into his work, he was a really interesting character, because there was a lot of kind of conflict with Fisher in terms of outlook. And Fisher was very much from the kind of academic focus of, you accrue knowledge and you want very high confidence in that knowledge, and that's why you have the sort of thresholds and the experimental science he's been forward. But Gossett was much more of a pragmatist. He was working for a big business, and there was one situation I think where he had a p-value of 0.13, and he said, that's fairly good evidence. If it's a business decision that doesn't cost much and we can explore further, it's worth going forward. Whereas Fisher would have had that, okay, if it's not hitting the 5%, we're not interested. And so I think for me that's a kind of maybe a part of statistics that got suppressed, I think, probably in a lot of the 20th century. I think Fisher and co probably won out in many ways in terms of imposing those criteria, and in some cases throwing away a lot of evidence. And although it wasn't sort of explicitly, Fisher was very anti-Bayesian, but I think that making use of limited information, that Gossett was very adamant. In some cases, I think he had budget to get 2 data points or something, and it was still like, I want to do something with that. So I think that would be a very interesting person to dig into the strategy. It also just sounds like he was just a very nice guy relative to Fisher and some of the others at the time. So yeah, I think that the kind of different outlook of where do you set the bar and actually, what are you trying to do with statistics? Are you trying to kind of get perfect knowledge, or are you actually just trying to make, better decisions in whatever job or industry you're in?
Yeah, I love that. So yeah, I think from what I understood, wasn't that hard to be a nicer guy than Fisher, apparently. But yeah, no, I mean, I definitely resonate with what you were saying, because all my models, most of my models, I do them not for academic use, but for companies. And yeah, like there is a lot of things you have to be able to prioritize. I think that's one of the most important skill to have as a modeler, especially if you're in a small team, right? If you're in a big project with a lot of modelers, you can explore a lot of paths at the same time. But if you're in a small team, then you have to really be able to set the priorities and see what path you want to explore first, because that's often a metaphor I use to explain what the modeling process is. It's like being lost in a desert and you're trying to find your way out. And the most efficient way is usually to explore a lot of paths and see which ones are successful. There can be several of them. There can be just one of them. There can be zero sometimes. But also exploring a path that ends up not being successful is actually very informative, because then that means the people behind you won't make the same mistakes and they won't go down that path. So to explore these paths, you can do it alone. If you don't have any more people, that's just going to take you more time, but you have to do it. Or you can do it with several people simultaneously. But that's where the idea of priorities also very important, because your priorities are going to dictate which path you go down first.
Yeah, and I think it's that as you said, the priorities and the focus that I think is a kind of angle which, maybe in the kind of the pursuit of perfection, we don't always get that balance right, particularly when it's kind of academic research interacting with very fast problems.
Right. Yeah. Awesome. Well, Adam, let's call it a show. That was an absolute pleasure to have you here on the show. As usual, I will link to your website and your socials and your books in the show notes for people who want to dig deeper. Thank you again, Adam, for taking the time and being on this show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to chat.
This has been another episode of Learning Bayesian Statistics. Be sure to rate, review, and follow the show on your favorite podcatcher, and visit learnbaystats.com for more resources about today's topics, as well as access to more episodes to help you reach true Bayesian state of mind. That's learnbaystats.com. Our theme music is Good Bayesian by Baba Brinkman, feat. MC Lars and Megaran. Check out his awesome work at bababrinkman.com. I'm your host, Alex Andorra. You can follow me on Twitter at Alex_Andorra, like the country. You can support the show and unlock exclusive benefits by visiting patreon.com/learnbaystats. Thank you so much for listening and for your support. You're truly a
good Bayesian. Change your predictions after taking information in. And if you're thinking I'll be less than amazing, let's adjust those expectations. Let me show you how to be a good Bayesian. Change calculations after taking fresh data in. Those predictions that your brain is making, let's get them on a solid foundation.